as you said, we're going to talk about improving pastures. Give you a kind of outline here of what I kind of plan to talk about. I'm going to just a little background on pasture in Kansas and different forages that we have available to us for grazing. Then talk about the pasture management itself. I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about renovation of pastures, but then you can see a little bit on weed control, burning, and grazing management. And then even, for a point where we would need to seed grasses, we'll talk a little bit about that. So what is pasture? Of course, most of us, we use that term. We've got what I call tame pastures, including, brome and things like that, as well as our native rangeland. But pasture simply is land covered with grass and other, usually mostly herbaceous plants that are suitable for grazing animals, including cattle and sheep. So if you look at this map, you can see, this was a 2017 ag census. They said there were a little over 15.5 million acres of quote pasture in the state of Kansas. And you look here, different areas, you can see significant amounts. We have pasture of just about in every county in the state. Some example then of forages. Forages are plants that are meant to be consumed by animals. And of course, we have this native rangeland that makes up that more than 15 million acres. We have warm season grasses that grow in these areas, many of which we can plant them, individually or in mixtures. Of course, and we can have small grains that we can graze, wheat and rye, those and triticale, those sort of products, some of which are used, as cover crops these days. Cover crops or crop residues in the state, sorghum and corn. Summer annuals can be used on areas of cropland, Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan hybrids. Cool season grasses, I mentioned, smooth brome, a little further, in the south central and southeastern part of the state, then you'll see tall fescue being used. And of course, then a number of legumes, even things like alfalfa, which we can actually mix in with some of our cool season grasses if we want to do that. So if you look at the time and these types of forages are available to us, our native rangeland is primarily warm season grass. So you don't normally hear we're in April, we see ought to be starting to green up, and it's a little slow this spring because of I think the dry weather and somewhat cool temperatures. But generally, that April through October is when most of that native range would be productive. Summer annuals like sorghum Sudan, it's more in the mid to late summer. The stubble is available to us as soon as we harvest our crops. Wheat and triticale, depending, you can use those in the fall, and graze them in the spring. Wheat, we can use that as a dual purpose crop, of course. But, by now, usually by the end of March, you start to see that first hollow stem and it's joining. And if we want to get a wheat crop, then we got to get off from grazing it at that point in time. Cool season grasses, typically in the spring and in the fall. Most of that production generally occurs in the spring, but we get, maybe 20-25% of the total would be in the fall of the year. And then you can see a couple other there, which say maybe alfalfa brome or some other legume with brome grass we can extend from when the brome is grazed, through much of the summer. So we're going to spend time talking about renovation, and what we're trying to do then is try to go about improving, existing pastures. That could be a complete makeover, partial or complete destruction of existing sod. But we're probably going to try to seed then to establish some more desirable plants that might be on that pasture at a given point in time. Some potential benefits from renovation, though, include hopefully we can increase the forage production and the number of animals that we might be able to use on that area. If we select our forages correctly, we can probably increase both the protein and digestibility of that forage that's available. May even be higher in minerals, important for animal performance. we may, if we look at our whole farm system, we might be able to improve the seasonal distribution of forages if we have primarily, so let's say, warm season pasture available to us, planting an area or renovating an area that to maybe a cool season can extend that grazing period of the year. And if we add a legume, typical reason we put a legume in a grass stand would be to decrease the need for nitrogen fertilization. So as I think about renovating pastures, kind of some of the factors we need to consider is, well, how bad a shape is it? Is there very significant loss of stand to the point where we need to think about trying to thicken it back up or replace it with something else? We probably need to look at our soil fertility in a lot of cases, and we'll talk, a little bit about soil testing there. Grazing management, if you're planning to graze that area, can you adapt or change? If you plant something back and you don't really change the way you've been managing, you may be back to renovation within a very short period of time. It does take maybe some specialized equipment. The topography that one has on a piece of property can have an impact on what we might do, and of course our climate and weather conditions also dictate what we might be able to do. Like say with the dry weather we're having right now, makes it pretty difficult to think we're going to be very successful, say, as trying to reseed. And again, doing a cost benefit analysis in terms of, was this going to indeed increase your bottom line if you renovate an old pasture that's not very productive to something that's hopefully more productive and has a higher quality. So the process that you go through, I mentioned a soil test, and we do that and try to correct any deficiencies we might have. It may be that you have an area, maybe some weed control needs to be done before you look at renovation. Can establish new species or different approaches. We'll talk a little bit about that and the equipment necessary. But in the long run, we want to hopefully develop a stand that we can manage for persistence that's going to be there for a number of years before we might have to think about doing something with it again. So these steps, again, soil test, generally we're looking at the major nutrients. If pH is low, depending on what we want to establish, we might need to think about liming to bring that back up. Phosphorus can be a deficient nutrient in the soil. Some of our soils indeed need some K or potash, depends on what part of the state you're in. But the lime, P and K can be added prior to or at the time of seeding. Most of the time, we don't recommend applying too much nitrogen. And of course, the reason, even though we know we can get plant response to nitrogen, many times that stimulates some maybe less desirable species that might still be there if you haven't taken them out of the system. Broadleaf weed control with using herbicides, weeds can be a problem if you're going to interseed into an existing stand or if you're no-till seeding. And if left remaining, those weeds, again, like I say, they may be stimulated more by fertilization, particularly with the nitrogen than what maybe a grass species you're trying to plant. If you're working with legumes, we have to be pretty careful about use of herbicides there because, if it's establishing, it's going to be difficult to, control broadleafs with a standard herbicide like 2,4-D because it will suppress or even kill off the legume you may be trying to establish. So if you're going to use 2,4-D and you think about that maybe the year ahead of time to try to reduce weed stands. And then the other thing that we need to be consider is some of these herbicides can have a period of time that you may have to wait before you can graze. That becomes more important actually once the stand is established and maybe you're trying to reduce weeds that might still be there. So when you're going through the renovation, you can, if you have existing sod and You can graze or cut that as close as you can to reduce competition from the old sod. And that makes, subsequent tillage and seeding operations going to be more easier to do and more effective. Some seeding tools, again, if we're going to use tillage, you're going to till to disturb a significant proportion of that sod. And then, of course, you want to use adapted legumes or a pasture mixture. Again, it depends on what you're trying to establish, whether you're going back to, native grass or a cool season grass or grass legume mix. You want to use species, of course, that are adapted to your area. So we got to use tillage, or we can use no-till. Again, it's pretty important to make sure you get that sod, though, suppressed somehow. But there are no-till drills out there that we can seed into existing sod. But again, you suppress that sod with a contact herbicide. A lot of people would use glyphosate or Roundup sort of product, because we can plant immediately into areas that have been sprayed with that, and because it doesn't have any soil activity. And again, I've seen situations where you basically kill out strips, that where you're going to plant into, with your herbicide there to kill out the sod. Mentioned broadcast frost seeding. In some cases, we may have a grass stand, but we would like to add a legume to it. A good way to do that, assuming we're in an area, maybe, we get some snow. That's what we call frost seeding. Back in, let's say, February or even early March, you can get a snow and you can just broadcast, put your legume seed or broadleaf right there on the snow. As the snow melts, it kind of takes it down into the soil. And that can be an effective way to establish some legumes. When do we start grazing these renovated fields? Again, if we're working with legumes, we have to be careful because chances are the legume might be more palatable to a grazing animal, and if they start grazing on those too hard, that can reduce your likelihood of establishing a good stand. So we may need a period of time for those legumes to establish. Again, we can, whether we mow things off, maybe for weed control or for grazing, sometimes we can do that in a way that favors the establishment of the legumes. But it's pretty important in that establishment time that we don't overgraze, and of course that's a good recommendation regardless of time of the year. Chemical weed control, there's lots of herbicides that are available to us in terms of whether we're working with cool season grasses, native range, this pasture renovation. We have this annual publication at KSU, chemical weed control publications, that are going to be available from your county extension or district extension offices to provide that information. Mowing, or what I call clipping or topping here, is that can be non-selective way of doing things and can damage the weeds and benefit the forages if we do it at the right time, and probably also if we don't mow too closely. And what that clipping or mowing does is it as these plants try to you cut them off and they try to regrow, they're going to utilize their carbohydrate reserves, and that can reduce their vigor. But clipping height's pretty important. Generally, if you have a new stand establishing, maybe the weeds are up above the grass, maybe mowing 6 to 8 inches high off the ground can be effective to reduce the weeds. But I think you just need to realize a lot of times if we're planting grass or whatever, we're going to have some weeds to deal with. And also pretty important, though, not to clip too close to frost, because particularly we don't want to mow off our plants that we're trying to establish, because if we do that, they may try to regrow and utilize their food reserves and cannot survive, going into the winter. Prescribed burning, of course, is a tool that can be used in pasture renovation, existing stands. We can use it when we're establishing new stands even, to a certain extent. Lots of reasons for burning. In our established stands, sometimes we may just have a buildup of litter or mulch, and reducing that fuel can be important. Even preparing seed beds. Some of these stands, I've seen grass stands, for instance. I mentioned the frost seeding. Well, if you burn off that grass stand back, let's say in February or early March, set the grass back, get rid of the old growth and maybe overseed or drill in a legume or a broadleaf plant that you want to establish, we can use fire to help in that process. Of course, on existing areas, suppression of brush and trees is a very important use. We can actually even use fire to reduce some of our invasive species. Fire has been used to create, maybe different ages of burned areas that can be beneficial to various wildlife species. Hopefully, if it's done correctly under the right conditions, we may even increase yields and availability of forage, improve grazing distribution, and increase our livestock gains, particularly with stocker animals. So I want to get into some just basic principles of grazing management that you see listed here, and we'll talk a little bit about each of those. The proper kind of animal. Again, this is a beef state. We usually have 1.45 million head of beef cows in the state, but we have other animals out there being used to graze, including sheep and goats, for instance. But how we distribute that grazing and stocking rate and grazing systems are all things that we can use to manage a given pasture. Mentioned one of the things that we need to think about in terms of what animals would prefer to consume is out of a forage textbook. And cattle, we know that they're grass eaters, but it turns out that they consume a very significant portion of other plants. Forums and legumes, maybe 25% of their diet. Sheep probably we know that they're kind of they'll eat a lot of different types of forage. They do like broadleaf plants, for instance, and goats or browsers. They're going to prefer woody plants if they're available. So the kind of animal, what type of pasture and forage we have might be, the kind of forage. Is it adapted to the kind of animals that we want to graze? As we look at this graph here is meant to show again how our plant growth is distributed across the state. Again, the green area there is for native, the native range, again, primarily that April into early October. I guess light blue color if you had a winter annual such as wheat or triticale. Again, it's got those production peaks where you may get it if you plant it early enough. You may get some grazing in the fall and into the spring. Brome or Fescue is kind of in that area between that and before the native starts. And then we get in the late summer, mid-late summer, we have what we call the summer slump. The native grass is starting to be not as productive, because most of that native production, 75% of its growth generally occurs by the middle of July, and then it's not a whole lot produced in the late season. Well, if you have an adjacent area where maybe it's cropland, and where you can produce a summer annual, again, like Sudan grass or a sorghum Sudan hybrid, that can be effectively used for grazing there in, July, August timeframe. And sometimes we would like to, distribute our grazing across the pasture. Just how is it dispersed? We know that animals are attracted to water. They're going to seek out wherever the water is and probably overgraze areas closer to water. They'll seek out shade in the heat of the summer. Animals will tend to graze into the wind direction, which in this state is in the summertime, at least, is primarily south or southwest. So everything else being equal, the southern end of a pasture often is overgrazed compared maybe to the north end. Topography can influence livestock behavior, though they may not utilize steeper areas and prefer, the lowland or flatter areas, or if they can get up on top of a hill, they'll go up there to get in the wind to help maybe fight flies, for instance. Other ways, of course, for distribution tools that we can use, Sometimes it, again, depends on the size of the pasture. Developing additional or alternative water sources can be important. We can fence off and which usually goes along then with maybe a rotational type grazing system, for instance. And then, like I say, numerous grazing systems are out there that can be utilized depending on what your objectives are or what you're trying to do. Other tools, where we locate salt and mineral feeders, that we, put those in areas to attract animals to them. If I have a kind of a brushy pasture, for instance, one thing I've seen done is you actually put your salt or mineral feeder right in the middle of the brush. The animals will go in there and they'll trample down the brush. They get kind of a positive impact by the grazing animal when you do that. Fly control devices can be used. Winter feeding locations, sometimes it's a good idea to move those around. Otherwise, you'll end up with an area that's kind of been abused because of overuse. Prescribed burning and or fertilization, if it's done on a partial basis on part of a pasture, of course, attracts animals to those areas over areas that are not burned or fertilized. Of all those grazing management principles I mentioned, the most important, frankly, is stalking rate. And regardless of the type of forage that we have, what we see done is as you increase your stalking rates, less animals there per animal, then the individual animal gains will decline, but gains per acre will increase, at least up to a point. Now, if you graze too hard, then that gain per acre will decline as well. Somewhere in the middle, and this is data based off native range out in the Hayes area, actually, somewhere in the middle, not necessarily where those lines cross, but is what we would consider to be a moderate stalking rate. That seems to be the sustainable rate that we can use. Usually has also been the most economical in the long run, at least. So that gets us to the idea, well, stalking rate's that critically important. How do you determine stalking rate? And there's a number of ways that's been done, but here's one approach that works pretty well. This gives us a safe, I think, a starting point. This example I'm showing you here is primarily for, let's say, maybe a cool season grass that we have, and it's producing about 3,000 pounds the acre. We have a 20-acre pasture. That HI up there stands for harvest index. And for cool season grasses, like let's say smooth brome, that can be a number, maybe 0.5 would be a reasonable number to use for that harvest index. We'll go through an example for native range, and we don't want to use that high of a number. And then, so we go through this example, we take, we got 3,000 pounds the acre, and say we got a 20-acre patch here of brome, times that 0.5 harvest index. So that's the number of pounds that's available to the animals. Let's say I'm running stalker animals, maybe they're averaging 600 pounds. And I'm making the assumption that they're going to eat about 3.5% of their body weight. So that's the 0.035. That's where that came from. And we're going to graze for 120 days. So that means in that 120 days, those animals would consume, there's the over 2,500 pounds needed per animal. If we divide the 30,000 pounds up there by the 2,520, it comes out to about that 12 animal basis. So in that case, we've got, we're not quite stalking at 2 acres there per that 600-pound animal, but close to that, and that seems like a reasonable number on relatively good brome stands. Now, the other example I'll give you is what about if maybe I wanted to run some cow-calf pairs? Maybe I've got 80 acres of native range. I'm going to graze it for the summer, 150 days. And so the difference here is that harvest index is only 0.25. I'm going to use a kind of average weight of the cow and a calf with it during the course of the summer. I'm using 1,500 pounds. Now, if you've got a 1,500-pound cow to begin with, and you got a calf with her, that number's got to be bigger. But I'm figuring, 1,150 to 1,200-pound cow with a calf by her side. And that cow and calf is not going to consume a highest percentage of its body weight. So I'm using 2.6% in this case. And then you see that again, 150 days. So if I divide that 60,000 pounds by 58.25, I come about 10 pair. So that's, about 8 acres per pair. And, in the Flint Hills, which is a little, maybe higher producing than where some of you are located, that's something 7.5 to 8 acres is a fairly common number to use. But the formula, it's as good as the assumptions that you're putting in there, but it usually works out fairly well. Numerous grazing systems are out there, and I'm not going to get into any details. I'd be glad to answer questions if they arise. People sometimes just season-long graze. They'll turn their animals out there for the whole grazing period. Some others, maybe again, if you have a cool season grass field and maybe warm season, you may utilize your cool season even up into early June. So you may be delaying or defer your native before it, rather than just maybe in early to mid-May, maybe it's, again, we wait 2 to 4 weeks later before we graze it. Rotational grazing is, of course, used with, we can have simple ones like 2 pastures where we just switch animals back and forth, or we can have multiple paddocks, under what I call management intensive grazing. Then, maybe we've got 8 paddocks and we move those animals around fairly quickly in the early season, but as the growth of the plant slows down, then the occupation period becomes longer, and the rest periods become longer in the pastures that are not being grazed. Parts of the state we use intensive early stalking or double stalking. As you get into maybe central and western Kansas, where we tend to have more short grasses rather than the tall grasses, double stalking is too much. We need to back off on that, and maybe I think at Hayes, for instance, 1.6 acres per steer for half the season worked quite well. The complementary or sequence grazing, that's kind of goes back to that chart I showed you where we can go from one forage type to another, utilizing those species when they're available, and hopefully at their best quality. In any grazing system, one of the things we've seen is it's important to rest these plants. We graze for the animal, but we need to rest for the plants. And so these plants, depending if they're grazed too closely, they're going to be very slow to recover. So we need to try to maintain a certain amount of leaf area out there, and then move the animals if possible. So we're trying to prevent, repeated defoliation on the same plants to maintain that vigor. For our warm season grasses, like most of our native range, we have big little blue stem, those sort of plants. Late summer rest is the time that's important to rest those, because that's the time of the year they're starting to translocate their carbohydrate reserves downward, into the stem bases of the plant, or in the case of a rhizomatous species like big blue stem, actually into that rhizome. And that allows those plants, they continue to respire during the wintertime. So they use some of that carbon up during the winter to survive. And then, of course, the cool season grass, trying to, resting it in the heat of the summer is the best time to do that. Some places, our neighbors to the east, like in Missouri, they sometimes try to graze it all summer long, but before you get into a drought period and, tall fescue, it turns white, it's not going to be very productive. And resting it during that heat of the summer would be the thing to do if you can. Cool season grasses, smooth brome and tall fescue are probably the 2 most common ones used. I know here in central Kansas, smooth brome is going to be better adapted, I think, than tall fescue. Tall fescue, again, you get south central and southeast, it's going to be something that we could produce. But I'll probably talk mostly here about smooth bromes. There's picture of smooth brome, if you're not real familiar with it. It's a rhizomatous cool season grass. It can be quite productive. It's very good palatability. Of course, it's going to respond well to fertilization, as I'll show you here. Most of its growth is going to occur in that March, April, May time frame, and in June. If we get cooler weather and some precipitation in the fall, we can get 20-25% of its annual growth can occur that time of the year as well. These cool season grasses, if we're thinking about establishing them, we can establish them here in the late winter, early spring. But typically, that February, March, or even early April, we tend to have more weed problems. So the better time to try to establish a cool season grass like smooth brome would be in that late August and September timeframe. Typical seeding rate, if you're going to drill, is about 15 pounds of pure live seed per acre. As I says, it does respond very well to fertilizer. So having a soil test and seeing what nutrients are needed, can be grazed or hay. 90 to 120 pounds is a pretty good dose. I'll show you some data with it that would indicate that, though, that maybe, and I've seen data even 80 pounds even during some of our drier years has still been an economical thing to do. If you're going to graze, typically we recommend splitting applications. Maybe we put a third of the fertilizer on in the fall, and say September, early October, that time frame. And that's particularly true of nitrogen. Well, nitrogen, you split your application of nitrogen, but that's the time of the year, if you need it, you want to put on your phosphorus and potassium as well. And based on soil tests, those are kind of the thresholds there. If your phosphorus is less than 25 parts per million, adding phosphorus might be a thing to do. Potassium is under 120. We might want to think about adding that. But again, back to the nitrogen, we split that, put a third on in the fall, and then the other 2/3 during the winter time. That can be, even in December before the ground freezes up, or in late February, early March is also can be a time we can apply nitrogen to cool season grass. Here's a long-term studies that have been done, a lot of site locations. This is the response of tall fescue and smooth brome have been pretty similar. But as you look at this data, without any nitrogen here, the yields were about 1.35 tons per acre. Well, if you put on about 80 pounds of nitrogen, and this average over a lot of years in sites, you basically double that production. And then thereafter, you can get a little more response, but it's the incremental increase is quite small. But that something in that 75 to 100 pounds usually is what we typically would recommend on these cool season grasses like smooth brome and tall fescue. Native grasses, here's typical ones: big and little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, cytoderma. Eastern gamma grass is a warm season native grass that some people have established by itself, and it can be a productive hay crop and can be used for grazing as well. It takes a little more management to keep it in a stand because we can't graze it very close to the ground without hurting its vigor. But these other grasses typically are used, when they planted CRP, or if you have an area, maybe you want to reestablish or go back, quit farming and go back to having native grass. Here's an example. The ideal time seems to be that in the spring there, March 25th through April 20th. We're getting at the end of that time frame right now as I speak to you today. But there are times we can extend that into May and still get good results. Sure helps if we get a quarter, half inch of rain after we plant, though, to get those stands established. The seeding rate, 4.5 to 6 pounds of what we call pure live seed per acre. So the little table here then is just an example. So we have for these 5 species, and these have been used a lot of areas in the state of Kansas. We might add some different species if we happen to be on a sandy soil. For instance, maybe rather than big blue stem, we might use sand blue stem. We might stick some sand lovegrass in there. But these 5 species have been used pretty widely in the state. We have named varieties for all those species. So just an example of what percentage of the mix they make up. If we multiply PLS pounds per acre times that percent, that gives us how many pounds of pure live seed we have per acre of each of those individual species. Indeed, you add up that column on the right, it comes out to 5.3 pounds of pure live seed per acre. So it's in that range that we typically would want to see. So kind of summarize, need to select forages that are adapted to the soils that you might have and the climate area, north to south across the state and east to west can make a little difference. If we need to renovate pastures, that indeed can be done. It requires some input, trying to graze them correctly ahead of time rather than, grazing them and overgrazing to the point where we need to really renovate would be the better approach. But we get situations where we need to renovate. Didn't talk too much about hay production, but a little bit, but managing hay fields for quality and production is important as well. If you're mowing, there's these native grasses, we'd like to see that hay put up by the middle July, so they have time to recover the rest of the summer. Soil testing for addition of nutrients that you might need, or we need to modify pH. Using proper stocking rates, grazing systems can be used, judicial use of prescribed burning, and then brush and weed control are all things that we can do to hopefully properly manage our pastures. So that pretty well completes what I had prepared present to you today. Be glad to address maybe any issues you have or questions. Let's see.
Does anybody have any questions for?
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll stop sharing there.
Okay.
I just posted a survey for those participants. If you could fill that out while we're waiting on questions, that'd be great.
So coming off winter, this Dr. Fick, winter is in our area has been extremely easy to feed cows because we've been drier than normal, even though our temperatures have been fluctuating. Those spots that that we feed in the winter, especially up closer to my barn lots, I've been doing that for years now. I would sure like to go back in those feeding areas. And do I plant some summer crops, or can I plant some seed, grass seed in there? And when I take them off to go to grass, then they'll be out of that area.
I think you sure could. One of the things I have concern about, do they clean up, when you're haying, do they clean it up well? If we have a lot of old hay or something left on the ground, one issue we can get into is fly problems. That hay and manure becomes a breeding ground for flies. So that can be an issue. So if you have that situation, I'd recommend cleaning up that old stuff to get it off of there to avoid fly issues. But yeah, if it's pretty well been tromped out, and you got bare ground situation, yeah, I think you could go in there and plant something. And again, there are probably some options, but depends what you want to use, or maybe complement what they need in their diet. A summer annual, might work quite well, for instance. You come off there, if you're going to native pasture by sometime in May, by 1st of June, typically, you got to have the summer annuals, you got to have a little warmer soil temperature, to plant.
Yes.
But, usually by the 1st of June, things are warmed up, and so going to summer annual can work. Of course, again, what's the weather going to be like this summer? If you have a situation where we're going to be, those plants are, you got to have some rainfall to get up and growing. But if we have stress of any kind, if you plant a sorghum species of any kind, then you could get prussic acid issues. Any of our plants we might plant can have nitrate problems, frankly, but with the sorghums, we got the additional issue with potentially prussic acid. One way to get around prussic acid, you could plant a millet, pearl millet or something like that. It doesn't have prussic acid issues like a sorghum sudan might. Yeah, so again, I think it just depends on what you want to, in addition to maybe just some sort of ground cover to kind of protect the area, something that's going to work into your feeding your cow herd at certain times would be the thing to consider. And that's usually whether it's close to your buildings or, people that go out and spread their hay in a pasture. A lot of times it's done just inside the gate and you get into similar issues.
Yeah, the weed, we have a wet summer, the weeds are tremendously tall. It come middle of the summer and fall, and then you're battling them just because you have that open ground where you fed and brought in some of them weeds each year. Or yeah, I do clean up around my hay rings and try to haul that off, get that piled up so the fly helps with the fly control. Definitely. I've been composting, making a couple of piles from years past and making that, and then selling that for gardens. So I've been using some of that as compost.
Something that we tried or we're looking at doing this year is going to get some Bermuda grass round bales and spread them out on high traffic areas and let cows stomp that in to see if we get some of that grass introduced to take some high traffic areas, because we've had pretty good luck with around where we work cattle running through a lot. A good standard Bermuda keeps that ground cover pretty good to choke out some of those weeds from coming in. So that's something that we've had work well. Just getting it established and getting it to survive the winter is a trick on that.
Just have some sprigs, or are you using seed?
What we've done was we've had some Bermuda that grows, so we'll take a tractor bucket and scoop it and move it around. That works pretty good. And then we're going to also try some hay with some seed in it and just broadcast that or roll it out, let the cow stomp it in and see if we can get that to establish also. We haven't done that yet. We're probably going to try that hopefully this summer.
Yeah, under the right conditions, I think any of those methods can help. And in Bermuda grass, where it's adapted, how far north we can go. Of course, years ago, we had a governor, he had it up around not too far out of Salina, so that's quite a ways north as I think about the normal range for Bermuda grass. But yeah, it can be used in the state. And I know there are people that produce it generally in the Wichita area. There's some seed producers in that area, because there are seed types, and then there most time we think about sprigging in Bermuda grass, but there are seed type varieties that can be utilized.
We've had good luck with crabgrass too, grazing that through the summer on spots where we'll plant. Let's say we've got oats out right now, and we'll have crabgrass come up when the oats are grazed off or after it's hayed. We've done pretty good on extending some grazing on spots like that.
Crabgrass, because it's a pretty good forage, and it's if you're going to utilize it year after year, because it's got to go to seed. But I don't know if you can keep crabgrass from not going to seed. It's
right.
pretty difficult, but it does quite well in some areas of the state. It's a warm season, so again, like I say, following your oats, you got cool season forage, and then you got a warm season forage like crabgrass after it. That's a good for cattle. And you can even, you can fertilize that stuff too if you want to. Again, fertilizer prices are high right now, of course, but it will respond to some fertilizer. Stephen, you have a question?
Well, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. I missed the first introductions. Is this going to be on the website where you can download it and view it again?
Yes, we will have it on all of our websites available for you to go back and watch it.
Okay. And I did see where you recommend getting the soil test. Is that something the extension office can do if I brought in a sample? Do you test it at the extension?
We send it into K-State and get it tested, and then they'll send the results back to us, and then we'll give you the results. It usually takes about 2 weeks time, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Yeah, when you soil test, of course, you want to get multiple samples in your field, and then kind of mix them together, and then take a sample out of that, put it in a little paper bag, and yeah, they'll send it in, and they're,
Excellent, thank you.
get your
And
results
so
back.
we have 2 horses and a donkey that we're keeping on about 7 acres with 3 acres in the back and 2 acres up front. So we have 2 fields that we'd like to kind of alternate the grazing on. I think we're right at the limit as far as acres per animal. So is there any recommendation?
What's
for
your
that
forage? What forage are you grazing? What are they grazing?
It's mostly Brome and just we just bought the property, so I'm not exactly sure what the grass is out there, but
But
we've been told
something cool season that's greened up now. We're starting.
it is starting to green up, and it's been over grazed in an area. So need to get them moved around, need to get a fence put up. But yeah, the plan is to graze them in 2 different areas.
Yeah, the horses and mules can go. They do all right together. There are no problems with grazing them together, or they got to be separated.
No, they do just fine, and we do supplement them with hay and grains.
Well, again, I think you're going to find in the middle of the summer, if it's cool season grass, there's not a lot of growth that's going to occur. But get in this time of the year, and once hopefully we'll get some rain, so these grasses start growing pretty good. Yeah, you could just rotate them back and forth between 2 pastures, and again, the thought is initially is that as these plants are more rapidly growing, again, if we can maintain, let's say at least 4 inches of height on there, and then move the animals, to the other pasture, let that regrow, and then move them back. That might be, your moves might be every, maybe about a 2-week interval might work pretty well early in the season. As the season goes along, and then it probably could be extended. But yeah, you're probably going to have to provide some supplement of some kind, hay and so forth, particularly in that heat of the summer.
Okay, and I did see the chart where you had what grasses grow well and what part of the season. So I imagine we would want to actually seed for the different grasses as well.
Well, again, how many acres you have and so forth, the one way if it's primarily cool season, if you wanted to establish an area that would produce, primarily in the summertime, you could plant some, go in that area and renovate and plant some native grass there. One of the things I probably didn't emphasize is the length of time. These native grasses take a longer time to establish. You just can't plant them, and it's going to be maybe at least 2 years before they're kind of fully established. So it takes some time for them to establish.
Okay, great.
Well,
Thank you.
Cool seasons, Brome, for instance, it'll establish quicker than that. But sometimes we plant that in the fall, and you can get some grazing use of it the next summer. Probably not full use, but some light use on it. But natives,
Okay.
it takes longer.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Well, I was going to ask, this is a question that I get quite frequently. When you talk about different warm season and cool season, a lot of time people ask, well, why can't I just plant a mix of it and then it'll produce all summer? You want to address that?
Well, you can do that. We get into situations like that, and even in our native range, places where that maybe don't burn regularly, we get Kentucky bluegrass is one of the cool season grasses that we get. And what that does, that can extend your grazing period. If you have something that's starting to grow in March before the native warm seasons start, you can start grazing earlier, and maybe even later into the fall. But my preference is again, I would prefer to have those in separate stands. I think it works better if if you have your cool season grass here to utilize when it's actually growing and most productive, then move the animals to the warm season, come back to the cool season in the fall if you have regrowth. That'd be my preference. I think it works better that way. Well, and again, what depends on what cool season grass is, but again, a lot of times, again, if we don't utilize fire in the management, they may have a tendency to take over the warm season grasses too, in terms of being in a mixture. And another thing is, definitely don't want to mix brome and fescue. Okay. That's two cool season grasses. Don't want to mix them because there's a difference in their palatability, and what you'll end up with eventually is a stand of tall fescue.
All right, thanks, Walt. And I'd say having them in separate areas makes them easier to manage too, as far as your fertilizer applications and all that stuff.
That's true. Yeah. Again, normally we aren't, unless our hay production, we might use some fertilization on our native grasses, but 30, not that 75 to 100 pounds we might recommend on brome, but maybe 30 to 40 pounds and 10 pounds of phosphorus on native grass. That's about all that's necessary for hay production. But even then, we got to be a little careful about, because that might stimulate any cool season grass that's in there. It might stimulate the broadleafs, and it can, fertilizing native grass stands can change the composition. So we got to be careful about that. Again, we'll use fire sometimes to set that back, keep those unwanted species out. But yeah, fertilizing your brome or fescue over here in a given patch, and maybe leaving your native grass, typically we don't recommend fertilization unless it's for hay. I see a question there in terms of addition of a legume, red clover, for instance. I think red clover, and when we add a legume, most all our legumes, we have to be somewhat concerned about bloat issues, and so we don't want them to be too high percentage of a mixed stand with the grass. But there's ways we can manage, and maybe the legume maybe make up maybe 30, maximum 40% of the stand, and you can manage it and not have bloat issues. But yeah, that's one way to reduce your fertilizer is getting a legume in there to fix the nitrogen for you. And again, if you're starting from scratch, those can be seeded. If you have an existing stand of cool season grass, you can either, like say, frost seed or try to drilling the legume in is going to work better, because when you increase your soil seed contact, you're more likely to get establishment. As I mentioned earlier, some with the Bermuda grass, sometimes you can broadcast the seed, and under the right moisture and soil conditions, an animal may trample that enough to get it into the soil where you can get stands established that way. But yeah, mixed stand is a good thing to do. Complicates management a little bit, but that legume, assuming it's been inoculated, will indeed supply the nitrogen for the grass plants. And that's, and I think in parts of Kansas, that's pretty well, pretty common to have, let's say in Northeast, where brome is primarily in northeast part of the state. Yeah, having red clover is typically used. A lot of times we'll use white, ladino clover with tall fescue is more apt to be used. I know of one study that was done in standing existing brome, actually up in north central Kansas. He being Dr. Keith Harmony, tried a bunch of different legumes. The one that established the best, and they were grazing these areas, was alfalfa, and it established quite well. But then you definitely need to, manage around the bloat issue, or make sure that you're getting some bloat guard into those animals to reduce the probability of having bloat.